In this presentation, we'll take a brief look at how energy is utilized by cells. This is a good introduction to the processes of cellular respiration and photosynthesis. One of the most basic truths of physical science is that energy can't be created or destroyed, but it can be transferred and transformed. So how do cells tap into this energy? Well, to look at that, we first need to learn about the different forms that energy can take, and we'll do this in a pretty simplistic way. Let's take a look at this picture from your book. The diver on the top of the platform has a lot of potential energy. That is, energy that has the potential to be transformed into another type. As he dives, he converts that energy, that potential energy, into kinetic energy. Kinetic energy is the energy of motion. Before he dove, he was still, with no kinetic energy. But now that he's in the air and moving, the potential energy has been transformed into kinetic energy. The further he falls, the less potential energy he has, and the faster he goes, with more and more kinetic energy. When he splashes in the water, he transfers that kinetic energy into sound energy and heat energy and kinetic energy of water as the water moves in the splash. By the time he's bobbing around still in the water, he has low potential energy and low kinetic energy since he's low and he isn't moving. The climber is using chemical energy stored in the food she ate and is converting it to kinetic energy in her muscle cells and eventually converting that into potential energy as she climbs higher. Whenever energy is converted from one form to another, there's an increase in entropy. Now, entropy is basically a measure of disorder, so we can say that whenever energy is changed from one form to another, there's an increase in disorder. If you remember back to the beginning of the semester, we said that one of the characteristics of living organisms is that they demonstrate a significant amount of order. However, the second law of thermodynamics says that disorder always increases. So, to maintain that order, organisms must spend energy. Furthermore, if an organism converts energy to maintain order locally, there must be an increase in entropy somewhere else in the universe. Let's see how that works with this moose. The moose eats some plant material, and within that plant material there are carbohydrates. For the sake of simplicity, let's assume they're in the form of glucose. In order to maintain its body in such an ordered state, the moose takes that nice, ordered glucose molecule and converts it into more molecules of carbon dioxide and water. As the glucose molecules break up, it effectively forms smaller molecules that are more disordered. So the increased order of the moose has the effect of decreasing the order of its surroundings. The second law of thermodynamics encompasses the entire universe. So you can't just look at the order of the moose. You need to take the rest of the universe into account as well. So where exactly does the moose get the energy from when it eats grasses? The energy is really stored as potential energy inside the bonds of molecules that the moose eats. When chemical reactions occur, atoms get rearranged and bonds are formed and broken. If a bond stores energy and it's broken, that energy is released. Some bonds store more energy than others. In general, more energy is stored in long bonds in which electrons are shared equally between the atoms, and less energy is stored in bonds that are short and in which the electrons are shared unequally. If we start off with a molecule that has many long, nonpolar bonds and allow that molecule to go through a series of reactions that effectively shortens the bonds, then the resulting molecules will have less energy in their bonds, and that energy will have been released. In biological systems, that energy is typically captured for use by the organism. We'll study how that works later. For now, let's just look at these two molecules, glucose on the left and a triglyceride on the right. Each of these, but particularly the triglyceride, has bonds that contain lots of energy. As they're broken up to form carbon dioxide and water, that energy is released from the molecules and used by the organism. how can we know whether a reaction will happen or not? If you have a molecule of glucose, will it break apart into carbon dioxide and water? Or will carbon dioxide and water spontaneously form glucose? We can evaluate whether a reaction is spontaneous or not by looking at whether the reaction causes an increase or a decrease of free energy. First of all, what do we mean by the word spontaneous? A spontaneous reaction is a reaction that's energetically favored to happen. That is, if you leave it alone without inputting energy, it will still occur. The reactants have higher energy content than the products. For example, when glucose reacts with oxygen, that's a spontaneous reaction. The reactants have higher energy than the products. We measure this through an equation that measures the change in free energy. This is the equation here, but rather than try to put numbers through this, I want to just think about what this means. The change in free energy tells us whether a reaction will be spontaneous or not. If the reactants have a higher free energy than the products, then the reaction will be spontaneous. We'll see that again in a minute. The change in free energy will depend on the change in the total amount of energy minus any change in energy that's lost as entropy. Let's look at this in a slightly more graphical way. If we have reactants that have high energy content because of the energy stored in their bonds, and the products of the reaction have lower energy, then energy is released in the course of the reaction. We call this an exergonic reaction, and it's spontaneous. Notice that the word spontaneous doesn't have anything to do with how fast the reaction happens, just that it's energetically favorable. If you have a molecule of fat on a plate, it doesn't immediately turn into carbon dioxide and water, although the reaction is spontaneous. In the case of exergonic spontaneous reactions, the change in free energy, delta G, is negative. If a reaction requires energy because the reactants are lower in free energy than the products, then this is called an endergonic reaction, and delta G is positive, and it is not spontaneous. An example of this is the reactions involved in photosynthesis. The energy input in that case comes in the form of light energy. Let's focus in a bit on the energy that's released in a spontaneous exergonic reaction. Remember that the reactants have a high energy content, higher energy than the products, so energy is released. Now, we could simply burn that glucose, and burning it would release energy in the form of heat and light. You can think of this like water flowing through a turbine. It generates a lot of energy all at once. Unfortunately, our bodies aren't really capable of harnessing this energy, and so instead, our cells break up that single reaction into a whole series of separate reactions that are individually small, but that release energy in a much more controlled way that our cells can harness. So, how do we harness that energy? Well, we do it through a chemical called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. You should recognize it from our discussions of nucleic acid. See the sugar and the purine? Unlike nucleotides, however, ATP has 3 phosphate groups attached. Notice that these 3 phosphate groups are each negatively charged. These negative charges make the phosphate groups repel each other, and they're sort of uncomfortable, sitting so close to each other. As a result of this, one of them can easily pop off, and when it does so, it converts into adenosine diphosphate, or ADP, plus an inorganic phosphate group, plus some energy. This energy can be easily used by cells. As a result, ATP is often referred to as the energy currency of the cell. Just like you can spend dollars at a gas station or a grocery store, or you can give it to a friend, your cells use ATP for a wide variety of reactions. Let's look at how that happens. Imagine that a cell needs to carry out an endergonic reaction shown here in green. The reaction, being endergonic, requires energy. It can't happen alone because it requires that energy and is non-spontaneous. The cell can couple a spontaneous exergonic reaction to that endergonic reaction in order to drive the endergonic reaction forward. In this case, the exergonic reaction is in purple. The reactants have higher energy and the products have lower energy. The difference in energy between the reactants and the products can be used by the cell in order to drive the green endergonic reaction. This is how ATP works. ATP itself is a very high energy reactant when it converts to ATP that's lower energy product. And the difference between them is energy that can be used to drive another endergonic reaction, here in green. Let's look at that in a slightly more concrete way. In this example, the cell needs to convert the reactants A and B into a single molecule that combines A and B with covalent bonds. This is an endergonic reaction. It requires the input of energy. In order to carry this out, the cell uses the energy of ATP. As you can see at the top of this figure, when ATP is a reactant, the free energy is much higher because ATP is a high energy reactant. Because of the high energy of ATP, it's able to transfer the high energy packets, essentially the phosphate group, onto reactant B. This is an exergonic reaction and can happen spontaneously. Some of the energy of ATP is used up in the reaction, and some of it is still retained in the phosphate group that's now attached to reactant B. In the second part of this reaction, the phosphate group detaches from reactant B and uses the energy to attach A to B. Again, this is another exergonic reaction and can happen spontaneously. So let's review what the cell has accomplished here. It's taken two reactants, A and B, which are individually of low energy, and joined them together in an endergonic reaction to create a higher energy product. That reaction, being endergonic, requires energy and cannot happen spontaneously. By using ATP, the cell uses a high energy molecule and allows any reactions to be spontaneous and exergonic. This example is very similar. Here, glutamic acid and ammonia are going to be joined together into glutamine. Both glutamic acid and ammonia are low energy reactants, and the conversion into glutamine is endergonic. That is, it requires energy. First, the cell uses ATP and attaches the phosphate group from the ATP onto the glutamic acid, making it phosphorylated. This is an exergonic reaction and is spontaneous because the ATP is high energy. The phosphorylated intermediate is now also high energy, essentially having energy transferred from the ATP. Glutamic acid can now join with ammonia to form glutamine in another spontaneous exergonic reaction. So in summary, you can see that the endergonic, non-spontaneous reaction of glutamic acid with ammonia is coupled with the exergonic breakup of ATP into ADP and inorganic phosphate in order to form the products that the cell needs. This type of endergonic reaction involving the coupling of low-energy reactants with the energetic dephosphorylation of ATP is very common in the cell, and it's the primary way in which the cell carries out endergonic reactions. So you're probably wondering, how do we get ATP? After all, ATP is a high-energy reactant, so that energy must come from somewhere. In another presentation, we'll look at cellular respiration and learn how the cell converts energy stored in molecules such as glucose into ATP. For now, however, simply recognize that energy from glucose and fats and proteins are used to bind that third phosphate group onto ADP to form ATP. And that ATP uses its energy to drive endergonic reactions and in the process gets converted back into ADP. In the next presentation, we'll look at how enzymes act as biological catalysts in order to speed up exergonic spontaneous reactions.